Dr. Doka, you're also a leader in grief counseling, and you coined the term disenfranchised grief. Can you tell us how you formulated this concept and how it manifests in the individual and from the individual to society?
Sure, disenfranchised grief was had a kind of interesting history, and it originally began as in a class I was teaching. And I learn a lot. I have graduate students. I like to think there's a lot of mutual learning that goes on with these students because they come from very rich experiences personally and professionally. And one time in this class, many years ago in the early 80s, we were talking about the grief of widows. And one of the students said, if you think widows have it tough, you ought to see what happens when your ex-spouse dies. Now that was like a bolt to me because I bolt out of the blue because I never really thought about that question. What happens when your ex-spouse dies? I remember turning to the student and saying, Mary, are you willing to talk about that? And she said, yeah. She said it was horrible. She said, I was married to a person for near 25 years. We were planning our silver anniversary cruise, and I came home early one day and found him in bed with a neighbor, with a friend of mine that I trusted. And she said within 2 years we had gotten divorced. It was a very acrimonious divorce, a very bitter divorce. He had married this neighbor. He developed cancer, and he died all within a 2-year period of that day. And she said people would come up to me on the street and say, congratulations, I heard you got him. And she said, to be honest, part of me felt that way. But the other part of me felt, well, wait a minute, this is the father of my children. This was my high school boyfriend, and nobody understood my grief. And I thought that was a fascinating conversation. And I decided to research the issues of people who lost their ex-spouses, whose ex-spouses died. And so I did a study of that, and two interesting things came out of that. One is that that people varied in their extent of grief. Some had more intense, some had less intense grief to the death of an ex-spouse. There were variables like time that affected that, but all of them said that nobody understood why I should be grieving. And then the second thing that was very interesting about that was that that all of them talked about their grief at the time of death and contrasted it with their grief at the time of divorce. And what was fascinating about that was psychologists really weren't using the term grief to describe the impact of divorce. They were using terms like the psychological sequelae of divorce. And so now people were, but people were describing their reactions as grief, as they should, because divorce is a loss. So then I did a second presentation, a second paper on persons involved in dyadic relationships without benefit of marriage, people who are living together, people who were engaged, people who had long-time dating reactions, people who were maybe very close to being married. And again, the same issue came out. People said, I had a significant loss, but nobody understood it. Nobody was there for it. And it became, and that's when I first used the term disenfranchised, because one of the people said it was as I didn't have a right to grieve. And that's what disenfranchised refers to. It refers to having a loss, and there's really, you cannot publicly mourn, openly acknowledge, or receive social support. And over the years, as we've talked about that concept, we talk about a number of different categories of disenfranchised grief. And certainly one of them is where your loss isn't acknowledged by others. For instance, the loss of an ex-spouse, or the relationship isn't acknowledged, I should say. The other is where the loss isn't acknowledged, such as a divorce as a source of grief. A third is where the griever is not acknowledged. For instance, somebody very young or very old, or a person with intellectual disability who still grieves a loss, but others may not always recognize or acknowledge or support their grief. And then sometimes there are disenfranchising deaths. such as suicides, or the way that people grieve is not acknowledged. People who grieve in a more cognitive style, or certain cultures that may be perceived as overly emotional. So it's been fascinating to see that, because over time, this concept has really resonated with people. And people constantly write and say, you've named my grief. I never really recognized my grief until you talked about it in that way.